know her topic well. She enjoys it, and you can see it every time she's presented. I did not enjoy math in school, so it's been hard sometimes to listen. But her joy is contagious in her topic, and you can see that she loves it. She understands it. She explores ways to improve our mathematics instruction for all students. She longs for students to see not only the usefulness of mathematics, but also, and more importantly, the beauty of math. Let me introduce our panel to you. We have Mr. Andrew Elizalde. He is the Math and Science Department Chair and Dean of Academics here at CCS. We have Kristen Smith, a math instructor here at CCS, and then myself, I'm Cody Bertram. I am a humanities instructor here at CCS. I already graded your paper. Luke, it's over. All right, Callen, let me pray for you. Father, I thank you for what you've done through Callen in this process, that you have given her eyes to see your beauty and your goodness through the lens of mathematics. I thank you that I've gotten to witness your beauty and goodness through the lens of mathematics because of her. Father, I ask that you would give her strength, you would give her courage, you would give her clarity of voice and thinking as she comes to present. We thank you and we praise you. Amen.
Many of you have probably wondered this during your time in mathematics education. But why do we spend so long studying math when the majority of us won't go on to use much of the content that we learn in our future careers or day-to-day lives? A few of the reasons why mathematics is valuable for all students is that it's a realm in which they can develop creativity through creating mathematical arguments, scenarios, and questions. It's also a realm in which they can explore permanent and transcendent mathematical truth. But beyond just mathematical truth, it's a practice ground for them to be able to develop skills at thinking logically and critically about more nuanced truths that will inform their worldviews. But these reasons for why math is valuable don't often seem to fit with our experience in the math classroom. Instead of math class being a place where we get to rigorously seek truth for ourselves, it seems like the place where seemingly arbitrary facts are imposed on us. This disconnect between why mathematics is valuable for everybody and how mathematics is being taught calls for a major shift in mathematics education. The answer to this call is problem-based learning. A combination of individual and collaborative problem solving is the best way to teach mathematics because it helps to develop mathematical creativity as well as a deeper understanding of content while uniquely exposing students to mathematical beauty. Before I assert the dominance of the problem-solving style of teaching, it's important to talk about what the traditional lecture and exercise-based style of teaching looks like in American classrooms, and then to demonstrate that American students are underperforming under that system. I'll start with the underperforming. The Trends in International Mathematics and Science Study, which abbreviates as the TIMSS, tests 4th and 8th grade mathematical abilities across 3 cognitive domains. It tests knowing, applying, and reasoning. Knowing tests how well do students know the material that they're supposed to have been taught at the grade level that they're at. Applying tests how well can students answer the type of questions that they're used to seeing in class. But reasoning gives students new types of questions that they haven't seen before, so they have to have a conceptual understanding of the knowledge that they're supposed to have and be able to creatively apply that to come up with their own solutions. There are 60 participating countries in the TIMSS, 5 of which are East Asian, and the East Asian countries always score as the top 5 countries, but the United States scores significantly below them. The key thing to note is that the disparity between the American student scores and the East Asian student scores is even greater on the reasoning section of the test than it is for the students' overall mathematics scores. This disparity, or this lack of skill that American students are displaying, especially in regards to problem solving and reasoning, begs the question, what's wrong with American mathematics education that's not allowing our students to perform on par with East Asian students? This would require a deeper look into the traditional American math class. So Dr. James Stigler, a former professor at UCLA, conducted a video study of German, Japanese, and American math classes. he found that each country had a different pattern for how their math classes were structured. The American math classes would begin with the teacher reviewing the concept from the previous day. And then the teacher would present a new type of question to the class. But right after presenting this new type of question, the teacher would demonstrate exactly how to answer this question, and then pass out variants of the same type of question for the students to practice themselves. What's important to note here is the distinction between a problem and an exercise. A problem is a mathematical question that a student doesn't know how to solve. But an exercise is a mathematical question in a recognizable format that the students know the steps to solving. What's obvious when looking at the American structure of teaching math is that what began as a problem is a new type of question for the students. The teacher immediately turned into an exercise when demonstrating how to solve it. When we teach through lecture and exercise, we're able to get through a lot of content because we just feed students information, they take it in, they make sure they can reproduce it on the next test, and then they do, and we move on to the next unit. But since we're able to move through content so quickly, we're not allowing students to take the time to develop a deep understanding of the content, and they're forced to rely on rote memorization to learn the material. And that's exactly what's happening. America places in the top third of countries for students who primarily learn their math through rote memorization. And the very section of the TIMS, which requires a conceptual understanding of the content, is where American students are doing most poorly. So into this dire situation of how American math classes are failing students comes problem solving as an alternative way of teaching math. I've briefly mentioned what a problem is. It's a mathematical question that a student doesn't know how to solve, but it might be helpful for us all to engage in a little bit of problem solving ourselves. So if you look at the structure of the room that we're in right now, you'll notice that the floor is in the shape of a rectangle. And then if you look a little closer, you'll see that the tiles are all squares of equal sizes. But maybe Covenant received a donation and the donor wanted the tiling to get a little funky. She wanted all of the tiles to be squares of different sizes. Could we actually fulfill the donor's request? Maybe think about how you would tile the floor to meet that request. Maybe you cleared all the tiles off the floor in your head and you started in the middle of the room and you focused more on the angles because at least you know you've got 4 90-degree angles and started to build this shape going out of different size squares, but you're starting to notice that there are gaps in your shape that are actually in the shape of rectangles. So it's really just the same problem replicating itself. So you scratch that idea. Maybe you started on that wall over there and you started tiling the whole wall and then you wanted to march forward across the room. But then again, you ran into the same problem with these rectangles appearing. So you decide to fill the whole floor with a grid and maybe combine all of the squares or certain squares into other squares of different sizes. Whatever approach you took, hopefully it was clear that there's not an obvious approach to take and that there's not an obvious way to tile the room. And that's what makes this form of education really exciting. The ball is in the student's court and who knows where the math class could end up going. A note about the excitement that problem solving brings to mathematics education is a story that I read. An artist had a nightmare that all art classes were taught without students actually doing any artwork. They would learn what colors look nice together and they'd practice dipping paintbrushes correctly, but it was far beyond these students to actually to put paintbrush to blank canvas. Maybe senior year, some students could do some color by number, but aside from that, this was beyond these students. And Paul Lockhart, the mathematician who wrote this story, argues that this is exactly what we're doing to mathematics education when we take the problems out of it. We're ripping the substance out of the subject, and we're saying to students, hey, look, this is math. But we show them all of this mathematical content without actually letting them engage in the math themselves. Aside from the excitement that problem solving brings to mathematics education, how is this practically going to help our students? Well, that's where the mathematical creativity comes in that it develops. But what actually is mathematical creativity? It can be divided into 5 different components: originality, fluency, flexibility, elaboration, and sensitivity. Originality is just the ability to have your own new original idea. Fluency is the ability to have a lot of ideas. Flexibility is the ability to change ways of thinking about a problem easily. Elaboration is the ability to explain your thought processes, solutions, and strategies to other people. And sensitivity is the ability to critique other methods of solving math problems. Individual problem solving specifically focuses on building a deeper understanding of content while also building originality and fluency. It helps to build a deeper understanding of content because it gives students the time they need to look at the problem at their own pace. We're not moving on when most of the class understands the material or when the teacher deems they've explained it well enough. We can only move on at the pace of the student's understanding because they're the only one in this situation. But your student probably won't be able to develop a complete understanding of the problem on their own, but they have the opportunity to pinpoint exactly where their misunderstandings are. And then along this same thread of individual problem solving, allowing for more time for problem solving, thinking about a problem for a long time and deeply often allows it to seep into our subconscious. And that's often the birthplace of creative ideas. We're all aware of the idea of shower thoughts where you're not really thinking about anything and bam, this creative idea comes. And when we allow students to have that time to think deeply about a problem, we give them the opportunity to develop their originality more. The practice of originality then builds fluency because practice makes better. And the more that students are practicing making their own ideas, the better they'll become at making more ideas in the future. But this isn't the whole story. We've only focused on 2 out of the 5 aspects of mathematical creativity, and your student probably still has a lot of gaps in their understanding of the material. So this is where collaborative problem solving comes in. Most of you are probably familiar with the idea of a book club where people are sharing their ideas about what a book means, maybe critiquing one another's ideas and posing questions to the group. Think of this same sort of scenario, but instead of trying to understand a book better, we're all trying to solve a problem together. There are all sorts of mathematical personalities that show up in these collaborative problem solving groups, such as the conjecturer and the prover and the critic and doubter and the exemplifier. And all of these personalities combine to help the group solve more difficult problems than they'd be able to individually. Collaborative problem solving helps to widen out students' understanding of the problem, as well as build flexibility, elaboration, and sensitivity. They help to widen out students' understanding of the problem because just as people will have different mathematical personalities, they'll also have different ways of understanding the problem, so they can fill in the gaps in one another's understanding. Collaborative problem solving helps to develop flexibility because students will also have different strategies for solving the questions. So I'm forced to look at the problem through the eyes of another student and through their strategy, which helps to develop my flexibility at looking at the problem in different ways. Collaborative problem solving then helps to develop elaboration because what if I'm the one explaining my idea to the rest of the group? And I get to, instead of just writing down a proof or a question that satisfies myself and I think is up to par or up to my standards, I have to face all of these people with their questions and feedbacks and critiques. And in facing all of that, I further my own understanding of my original ideas. Collaborative problem solving is probably the most accessible environment to build sensitivity. Because whereas in the traditional lecture and exercise math class, where the teacher is probably spouting off the most refined way of solving the problem, in the collaborative problem solving group, these are just your fellow peers' ideas that are probably often wrong or rough around the edges and are ripe for critique. But we're also in an environment where we're all working together to solve a problem. So it's the perfect environment to practice constructive criticism, which is sensitivity. Individual and collaborative problem solving pair well to allow students to engage in the mathematical experience, which develops all 5 aspects of mathematical creativity that are central to that experience, as well as helping students to develop both a deep and wide understanding of the math content. This sets them up to uniquely appreciate mathematical beauty. Math is beautiful for a myriad of reasons, some of which combined with the reasons why it's valuable for all of us, such as that it's a realm in which people can express themselves creatively, and we can actually mirror God as sub-creators by creating questions and scenarios within this logical reality that he's placed us. It's also an area in which we can rigorously pursue truth. And we see in Acts, Luke commending the Bereans for rigorously seeking truth in what Paul tells them. So it's an area in which we can develop this godly quality of seeking truth for oneself. Beyond that, it's a language with which to describe God's creation. And it makes more, so we can explore that God's creation through a different lens. And it makes more evident to us the tension between the infinite and the finite. And some of these reasons why math is beautiful might seem a little bit obscure. So I'm going to go into a specific mathematical concept and talk about why this highlights some of these aspects of mathematical beauty, and then discuss how problem solving would help students to understand that beauty in a unique way. So imagine that you've got a right triangle with sides of equal length. The length will be 1, and we wanted to know what our hypotenuse is equal to. So we would just plug that into the Pythagorean theorem. And I'll write over my triangle a little bit, but the square root of 2 equals h. So I'll write it over here so it's more clear. Our hypotenuse is equal to the square root of 2. But I don't really have a lot of context for that number. I don't know what that actually is, so I plug it into my calculator. And I get that the square root of 2 equals 1.4. Great. But then my friend plugged it into her calculator, and she got that it equals 1.414. And then our other friend learned that it actually equals 1.4142. And none of these are completely correct. Actually, the square root of 2 goes on forever. Or the measurement of it does. So do a little ... but its measurement is infinite. But then we look back at this triangle that we made, and my depiction of it is a little bit messy, but you've got this perfect triangle in your head where we started our hypotenuse here and we ended it here. So we know for sure it's this finite number, but its measurement is infinite because it's an irrational number. So that's beautiful. You can see just from me telling you through lecture about this tension. But if I were problem solving, maybe I'd be proving the irrationality of the square root of 2, that its measurement actually is infinite, which, by the way, if you wanted to engage in some problem solving, mathematicians agree that that is one of the more beautiful proofs of their discipline. So if I had taken the time to prove that the square root of 2 is irrational, then I'd have to ponder for longer this tension between the finite and the infinite. I'd have to appreciate that in a deeper way. I'd also be creating my proofs. I'd be mirroring God as a sub-creator and rigorously seeking truth within this reality that he's placed us. Individual and collaborative problem solving is the best way to teach mathematics because it's helpful to all students. Those who will go on to use mathematics in their future day-to-day lives and careers, and those who won't. It's helpful to those who will because it develops a deep understanding of content, as well as math skills, which sets them up to interact with different mathematical concepts that they weren't able to be taught in primary and secondary education. Beyond that, it's helpful to everybody, the students who won't go on to use math in their future careers, because it's exposing them in a unique way to this beauty and developing skills that will be helpful to them in all aspects of their life. So if you're a teacher, I'd charge you to add problem solving to your math classes as much as possible. It's the best way to teach math. And if you're not a teacher, you're just a student or somebody who doesn't fit into either of those categories, I'd encourage you to give math a second shot through problem solving this time to experience its beauty in a unique and active way. Thank you.
Well done, Callen. We're now going to move on to the panel questions.
Hello, Callen. So we're not allowed to talk while you present, but if we were, I would have said, "Preach it, sister."
Nice.
Yeah, you've spent so much time preparing for your presentation, and it's just been a pleasure to watch you pour yourself into your topic. And I have to confess, like every time you presented, it just kind of warmed the mathematical part of my heart, and reminded me of what I believe about my own teaching my own profession, and I found it really, really encouraging. So thank you. And I never got tired of hearing it. I've heard it a bunch of times, but it's as good every single time. So
Thanks.
great job today. Now we're going to throw some questions at you. So I'll get us started and we'll go down the panel and kind of come back for a second round. So my first question is that teaching through problem solving seems to require a greater amount of time than the kind of direct instruction that you either directly or implicitly critiqued. So how do you suggest that teachers make the time to teach in this way when most teachers already feel really pressed to rush breathlessly through the textbooks that are in front of them to cover all of the most important content? How does a teacher actually make the time to teach in the way that you've called them to?
So often, especially in the lower grades, when we're first exposing students to this, it will take a little bit more time and we won't be able to reach as much content. But because we're not reaching as much content, but instead focusing on building a deeper, more foundational understanding, this sets students up to be able to appreciate more of this content that we weren't able to reach that would be more of interest to them or of use to them later on. So we do have to kind of pick and choose which concepts we most want to focus on, but it's also a cumulative way of teaching. So if I'm beginning in the lower school and I'm starting to build these problem solving skills and math skills in students, then as they go on, they're able to develop they have developed the skills to interact with more complex concepts and solve problems faster. So it's actually helpful to allow us to reach more content in the future.
Great job, Callen. I echo what Mr. Elzalde said. It does warm my heart as well.
Thanks.
Teaching through almost stole your question. Not allowed to do that. In the past 14 months, education has been through some drastic changes due to the COVID epidemic. Some families, students, and parents may now embrace the idea of online learning. Is it possible to teach math as you have suggested in an online environment? If so, do you foresee any struggles? And if not, why?
So it is possible. And actually in my research a little bit, COVID kind of came in helpful because specifically there's a YouTube channel called the Math Circles, which is a group of kind of problem solving math people. And they would actually put their problem solving classes on Zoom and have them on YouTube. And so they were able to engage with them over Zoom and bring in anybody who is able to kind of zoom in. But I do foresee problems in just being able to talk to people and engage about the problem. And I think that, I'm glad that we'll be able to get towards more of an in-person way of solving math, because I think that the community is a huge aspect of math, but it's also something that's more discussion based. So it is accessible over Zoom technology.
Callen, in current education, STEM programs are very popular. Many parents look to STEM programs for the future necessity of the industries that are going to be in our country. And I'm wondering, how does your suggested method, how would it aid STEM programs? And in other words, I'm asking, what value does this method of teaching practically serve for our nation's future engineers, medical science, career-minded people?
I think that goes back to developing math skills and understanding of content earlier on set students up to be able to interact with concepts that they didn't get the time to learn either through problem-based math education or in traditional lecture and exercise math education. So it sets these individuals up to be able to engage in their career better. But also we see a lot of evidence of students who are low performing math students really benefiting from this type of education, and it just awakens this mathematical sense in them that they didn't know they had. So we'll be getting a more diverse group of people who understand math in a unique way if we were able to actually allow students to do math instead of just lecture them about it.
So are there certain age ranges or grade ranges where teaching through problem solving is more suitable than others? For example, is this kind of pedagogy just as appropriate for a graduate school student as it is for a grammar school student?
So I think when we look at especially lower grades in grammar school, it's helpful to be able to do some lecture just so students can develop a concept or some context for what math is and some mathematical truth. But also there are definitely problems that are accessible both to students who are younger and then problems that are fitting for those who are older. And then with graduate students, that's often a more vocational way of learning math. So I'm arguing that this is the best way to teach math because it's helpful for everybody. But once you're looking at math in a more vocational way, if you were wanting to just get through content faster, you might just learn it through lecture and exercise. But I think Paul Lockhart, actually the person I referenced earlier, his ideal math curriculum for especially lower school kids would just be us playing chess and Go and games the whole time. So there are definitely individuals who argue that this should be completely immersive, especially in the younger grades.
Callen, there's so much pressure for high school students to achieve on standardized tests such as the ACT and the SAT to be competitive as far as college entrance. Do you have data that supports student success on these specific tests when using this type of curriculum?
I haven't looked at specifically how students improve with standardized testing, but I do think it's important to remember that the SAT specifically doesn't expect students to have learned all of the content up through like senior year, but still at the beginning of senior year, they can take the SAT. So there's a lot of wiggle room for students to be able to take more time to understand concepts and to develop problem solving skills. So on the SAT, if they were able to reach a problem that they didn't actually understand, they might be able to solve for it a little bit during the actual test.
In your paper, Callen, you don't give too many solutions for reluctant students or students who struggle in mathematics. And considering that the issue of class sizes are growing, learning difficulties in a class that can be upwards of 30, 35 students, how would a teacher manage this way of teaching with over 30 students in their class? It seems rather daunting to have this level of and quality of participation and to be able to monitor progress at the same time.
So Keegan math is or Keegan instruction materials kind of in general, it's not specifically focused on math, but that's an initiative which tries to give some strategies to help either large class sizes or reluctant students. And they have some strategies such as, well, let's split the class into multiple discussion groups, or there's a really cool one where we pair students just in pairs of 2 people, all the students, and it's like timed explanation. So I'm going to explain the concept to the person I'm paired with for maybe a minute, and we'll start the stopwatch, and then after that, we'll turn it around and they'll explain something to me instead. So everybody is in smaller groups and they're forced to interact with their peers.
We're going to go to a third question for each of us. So given that most math teachers in America are unfamiliar with any kind of working library of historically relevant, philosophically challenging, and or intellectually rich set of real problems, not exercises, but real problems, are you envisioning a kind of pedagogy that will most likely never be realized in the majority of American classrooms?
Personally, I doubt that this will ever become the norm, especially just with the higher emphasis on let's get as many college credits and highest test scores as we can. But I think that even though none of us are used to this way of teaching math, there are definitely resources out there, such as Phillips Exeter Academy. Their whole curriculum, there is no lecture and exercise. Their textbook is just PDFs of problems, and you can access it for free online. Any of us can. And so if you were a teacher wanting to implement this and not really knowing where to start, you would be able to access resources of just time-tested schools and the problems that they use in their curriculums. That actually, I think they do have students kind of engaging with them to help form what these problem sets are and give feedback.
Callen, implementing a math curriculum of this type, as we've mentioned, involves a great investment of both time and money for school districts, individual schools, and certainly the teachers. How would you suggest that a school, whether it be private or public, be able to move forward with such changes with restricted budgets and time, restrictions in time as well?
I think especially with the time, going back to that, well, part of it is the individual problem solving. This is when we're sending students home. This is during their homework time. And we're able to save the time in the classroom mostly for collaborative learning. But I think that since we're getting students actively engaged in the math, we're actually using time in the most efficient way we can by helping them all to be engaged, especially if we're using Keegan strategies where they're in smaller groups or they're paired with people instead of who knows who's really listening to the lecture and absorbing as much content as they can. If we're forcing them to engage in it, then we're making sure we're using all of the time we have as efficiently as possible.
All right, Callen, I'm going to ask one more question from the panel, and then we'll move to the audience. You mentioned in your paper and in your research that the TIM scores for American students were less than impressive. Have you found in your research that many American students are going to these countries for instruction because the TIM scores are higher in other countries? Do you find American students traveling over there to go to university rather than them coming here?
I haven't seen a lot of that, and I think part of that might be that, as I talked about earlier, once you get into higher level education, it's more of a vocational direction that you're taking. If you can get the content here in your own language or you know the culture, then that might be better than going somewhere else where it's more skill focused, especially once you've narrowed down what you want to do. But I think instead we see us taking some of the strategies of these foreign countries and trying to implement them here with things like Singapore math and more kind of hands-on ways of looking at problems instead of just concepts the whole time.
All right, just for ground rules for the audience questions, you get one question, no follow-up. This microphone belongs to Jason Merritt. He does not share this microphone, so I will hold it for him. We will prioritize adults and then move to students from there.
Great job, Callen.
Thanks.
We're very proud of you. My question is this, in the lower grades, in the lowest grades, in fact, do you completely rule out any rote memorization, times tables, addition facts, things like that? Do you think there's no place for that at all?
No, and I think memorization is fine. It's just the memorization without actually understanding content that is the issue, because then students are more prone to forget it. But I think especially in lower grades where we're wanting to develop more of a mathematical context and facts that will just be helpful for later, then it is extremely helpful for students to take time to memorize things that they also have been taught in a way where they can understand it.
Next question.
Great job.
Thanks.
I had a question. So we've hosted exchange students from different countries in Southeast Asia, and they go to school 6 days a week, 8 to 10 hours a day. These girls did specifically. Do you think that has any effect on how much time they're given to do this kind of math? I mean, has your research showed anything
Well,
with the reality of what we have?
I
as far as
didn't actually, sorry to cut you off. I didn't actually go into, with Dr. Stigler's study, what the Japanese and German classes looked like, but the Japanese classes definitely had, I mean, just the way that they were teaching, more time in the classroom would definitely be beneficial for that, because they would start with giving students time to think about a problem individually. And then after doing that for a long time, the students would get into small groups where they would share ideas and work collaboratively. And then the groups would present their ways, what they'd learned about the problems to the rest of the class, with the teacher only engaging through kind of commenting on the group, recapping and then commenting on what the groups had come up with. So the more time that these Japanese classes had definitely allowed for them to have creative class structures.
I was just wondering, because it has been a long time since I have been in a math class, so I get you don't use it very much after you're gone.
Yeah.
What does homework look like with this setup? Is it just group projects all the time?
The way I would see homework is after a problem is introduced, going home and being able to think about that and look at it and just kind of leisurely look at it, so that when you come back to the group, you're able to come back with your findings and talk about what you learned. So individual problem solving would mostly be in a homework context, while collaborative problem solving would probably be the majority of class time.
Callen, did you look at how does grading work with this? Because I know in my house, they get very upset about grades not being what they think they should be. So how does that play into this?
I didn't see specifically like ways that we did tests like this, other than just, I mean, it would be a new sort of problem to students on the test. So that is something that's kind of scary for students. But also, I guess with Phillips Exeter Academy, their whole class structure also is called the Harkness method, where they're all just centered around a round table with the teacher actually at the round table with them. So I imagine that we could do some graded discussion-esque things, since the whole class is just students conversing. And that would be a little bit less pressure on students than I have to individually solve this problem, as opposed to let's all just look at it together. And by the way, I mean, it is graded, but contribute what you've got and we're all going to work together.
Hi, Callen.
Hi.
With this knowledge that you've gained through your study this year, what do you plan on doing with it in the future?
So I don't really think that as it's set up now, mathematics education is conducive to really enjoying math and seeing the beauty in it. It's more of a practical thing. So with my personal engagement with math, I more plan on hopefully joining some smaller classes. That's part of the reason I chose a liberal arts school, but also just engaging in problems with myself and other people who are interested in it, as opposed to pursuing a math degree.
So since we're all so heterogeneous in our capacities and our learning styles and whatnot, what have you been able to discern as far as the applicability of this for different learning styles?
So I think that a little bit this relates to, I learned that surprisingly also East Asian cultures, I mean, surprisingly because they're so good at this sort of problem solving, but they're also less prone to kind of go against what authority says. So often those students find it a little bit scary to go against what a teacher would say and, hey, this is my idea. So I learned that what the paper that I was reading about that said was that, especially if your learning style isn't really, or what you're comfortable with isn't something that we see in this class, then that's especially where we need to be developing these skills. So as Mr. Morris says, often the things that you don't want to do is the thing you need to do most.
Hey, Callen, could you give some ideas to parents on things we can do to proactively support the ideas that you have, and things that we do that maybe diminish the classroom experience for creative ideas like this?
There's a lot of evidence that just math anxiety in parents is really transferable to students. So I think that the more positive that you can be about math as an art form and something that's beautiful and that there's no pressure behind, it's just exploring topics and even finding some specific mathematical concepts and problems that you thought were interesting would help your students see math as more of a accessible thing, as opposed to this is some scary thing that my parents are scared of and I'm scared of and we just have to get through. Mhm.
Callen, I haven't read your thesis, but in your thesis, did you look at Montessori way of teaching or manipulatives that could be brought to a higher level of teaching?
I did not, no.
I think that would, can I say something? Okay, because I just think that would be something that kids could build models with, you know what I mean? And
Yeah.
learn more and hands-on stuff.
Well,
with kids.
I will say the structure of kind of the Singapore style of math is one thing that they emphasize is first, let's actually get hands-on and have little cubes or shapes or pyramids that students are dealing with, and then we'll talk about kind of the more abstract concepts. So I think that along with problem solving and engaging with the math comes, let's engage hands-on in the math. So we do see that through some of the styles of teaching this way.
Callen, great job. Even as a humanities guy, you made me love math more. And so kudos on that. I guess I'm kind of curious whether your research showed anything. I mean, there's a recognition that the Asian countries seem to do this better. We don't. And you said that there were studies that showed just what they're doing in class. I'm wondering if if there's any evidence, yes, we do it differently and their method seems to be working better. I'm trying to figure out if there's reasons why. Like as I brainstorm, there's questions to me of, and a lot of this has already been brought up by other people. There's issues of class size. There's issues of time. There's issues of how do you grade things, and there's issues of how do you have self-motivated students? Because I'm guessing this works really well with self-motivated students, and maybe is a nice opportunity for those who aren't to sit back and coast.
Yeah.
So with all those differences, is there any evidence to suggest what is it behind what the Asian schools or cultures are doing that's allowing them to do it? Do they have a different way of grading or viewing grades? Do they have smaller class sizes? I think we all recognize they apparently spend more time. What are the differences that are maybe allowing them to do it that we might need to also consider? In other words, we can't just have the result without some kind of other practical change. Do you have any insight on what we would need to do differently?
I think focusing on that strategy that the East Asian classes have, specifically the Japanese ones, of splitting the groups up or splitting the class up into several groups that work together is helpful, especially when we're working with large class sizes. But one thing that's just kind of a niche fact that I learned while looking at the structure of the classes was, at one point the researchers were watching the videos of these classes, and they saw in the American classes, oh, the bell went off and there was like an announcement or something mid-class, and the Japanese researchers were just shocked by that, and they were like, there would be nothing that would interrupt class and students understanding the material, and they were horrified. And so it was interesting for the American researchers to be like, oh, that's totally normal, and they were like, no, in our class we just focus on the math and we can do announcements elsewhere.
All right, Callen, we have a senior question.
So in class problem solving, where the class is presented a problem and told to just kind of work it out together, I feel like there's always going to be some students that naturally excel at math and are able to figure out those problems quicker than other students. So how do you avoid it becoming a situation where a student is the one lecturing rather than the teacher lecturing?
So part of that is the Keegan style, where there is literally a stopwatch where you have to be talking during this time and then they have to be talking during this time so that everybody gets the opportunity to engage in it. And then also in the Harkness method of teaching math, where they're all sitting around the round table, the teacher would point out specific people like, oh, I know, John, you looked at that problem last night, so why don't you kind of explain it to the group? And then he would interact with people's questions, and then the teacher would call out another student. So those are a few strategies for how it's helpful. And then personally, I might split up my groups into students who I know that these people are all kind of on the same level, so that hopefully one person isn't just taking the lead the whole time.
So my question was, can you apply this this way of learning math to other subjects in school?
Yes, definitely. I think I was talking to Dr. Merritt about this kind of midway through the year, but there's a lot of evidence that specifically with languages, a more immersive style of teaching is super helpful for the students to actually glean something from the language class. So and then even in humanities classes, we are seeing more of an emphasis on kind of graded discussions where everybody's engaged in it. So I think that it's a helpful way of teaching in all ways, but math, since there is a lot of content that often we feel pressure to get through, it's a subject that especially is kind of kicked to the back and, oh, just lecture and exercise. And because, I mean, it's a cumulative subject, and if you're not learning in this style, it's harder to jump into it. So I think that math is especially a subject where we should focus on so that everybody can experience this, and it's not necessarily obvious to people that this is the way to experience math.
Well, Callen, you're finished.